Sarah Mitchell made a choice that morning in Terminal C that would alter the course of her entire life, though she couldn't have known it as her worn sneakers skidded to a halt on the polished airport floor. She was rushing toward Gate 27, clutching a ticket she'd saved 3 months to afford, when she saw him. An elderly man crumpling near the coffee stand, his face pale, his hand clutching his chest. Other travelers streamed past like water around a stone. Sarah's flight was boarding. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma waited at home, counting the hours until her surgery, counting on her mother to be there. But Sarah stopped anyway, dropping to her knees beside a stranger. Never knowing she was helping William Hartford, the billionaire owner of Skyward Airlines, the very company whose plane would leave without her, the man who would soon change everything. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Sarah Mitchell had been awake for 23 hours straight, and it showed in the dark crescents beneath her eyes, in the way her shoulders curved forward as though carrying an invisible weight. At 38, she looked both younger and older than her years younger, in the hopeful set of her jaw, older in the weariness that had settled into her bones like winter cold. Her coat, a navy blue thrift store find from 4 years ago, had a frayed hem and a button that no longer matched the others, hastily sewn on with whatever thread she'd had available. She wore it anyway, pulled tight against the airport's aggressive air conditioning, one hand clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag, the other gripping a boarding pass like it was made of gold. Because in a way, it was. That ticket represented 3 months of saving, of skipping lunches, of walking the extra 2 miles to work instead of taking the bus, of every penny scraped together from her hospital janitor wages, earned through double shifts that left her hands raw and her back aching. She worked the overnight shift at County General, mopping floors that doctors walked across without seeing her, emptying trash bins in rooms where life and death decisions were made by people who never learned her name. She was invisible in the way that working people often are, a ghost in scrubs moving through fluorescent-lit hallways. But Sarah didn't mind being invisible. She had Emma, her daughter, 7 years old with her father's dark curls and Sarah's stubborn chin, was home with Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waiting. The surgery was minor. The doctors had assured her a simple procedure to correct Emma's chronic ear infections. But to Sarah, nothing involving her daughter and an operating room felt minor. She had promised Emma she would be there when she woke up, had promised to hold her small hand and tell her everything would be okay. Sarah Mitchell kept her promises. That's who she was. So she moved through the crowded terminal with quiet determination, weaving between travelers who didn't see her, past businessmen in crisp suits checking their phones, past families with matching luggage sets, past the life she would never know. She didn't resent them. Sarah had learned long ago that resentment was a luxury she couldn't afford. She simply kept moving, kept surviving, kept loving her daughter with a fierceness that made everything else bearable. Gate 27 was still 300 feet away when Sarah saw him. The elderly man appeared first as simply another figure in the endless stream of travelers. But something in his movement caught her eye, a stumble, a falter, the way his hand reached out for the wall of the coffee shop and missed. He was perhaps 75, maybe older, dressed in a quality suit that spoke of money and taste, navy pinstripe with a silk tie slightly loosened at his throat. His silver hair was neatly combed, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like someone important, someone powerful. He looked like he was dying. Sarah watched as his face went from pale to gray, watched as his other hand clutched at his chest, fingers pressing against his sternum as though he could physically hold his heart together through sheer will. He swayed, his eyes glazing with confusion and pain, and the tide of humanity simply flowed around him. A woman in yoga pants and designer sunglasses sidestepped him without breaking stride. A businessman with a rolling suitcase muttered something impatient as he maneuvered past. A teenage boy with headphones didn't even look up from his phone. No one stopped, no one saw. Sarah saw. Her gate was closing in 15 minutes. She heard the announcement echo through the terminal. Final boarding call for Flight 314 to Richmond. Her flight, her daughter, her promise. The elderly man's knees buckled. Sarah didn't think. Thinking would have meant calculating, weighing, choosing between her desperate need and this stranger's crisis. Instead, she simply moved, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she ran toward him, her canvas bag sliding down her shoulder. She reached him just as he began to fall, catching his elbow, steadying his weight against her smaller frame. "Sir, I've got you," she said, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "I've got you. You're okay." Up close, she could see the fear in his watery blue eyes, could feel the tremor running through his body. He tried to speak, but no words came. Only a gasping breath that sounded like drowning on dry land. Sarah eased him down to sitting, his back against the coffee shop wall, and fumbled for her phone. "Someone help!" she called out, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Please, someone call for help." A few heads turned, most kept walking. "Sir, stay with me," Sarah said, kneeling beside him on the cold terminal floor, taking his trembling hand in hers. "Help is coming. Just breathe. Just stay with me." In her peripheral vision, she saw the digital display at Gate 27 change. Now, boarding. Time moved strangely in those minutes, both crawling and racing as Sarah knelt on the terminal floor. Her hand wrapped around the elderly man's trembling fingers. She spoke to him in soft, steady tones, the same voice she used when Emma woke from nightmares, when the world felt too big and too frightening. "You're doing great," she murmured. "Help is coming. Just keep breathing with me, in and out." That's it. The old man's eyes, watery and confused, fixed on her face like she was an anchor in a storm. His lips moved, trying to form words, but Sarah shook her head gently. "Don't try to talk. Just breathe. I'm right here." She could hear the announcement system crackling to life somewhere behind her. "Final boarding call for Flight 314 to Richmond. All passengers must board immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah turned her head, just enough to see Gate 27 in the distance. The line of passengers had dwindled to nothing. A flight attendant stood at the podium, looking down at a tablet, preparing to close the door. Sarah could run. She could still make it. Her legs were strong from all those double shifts, from all those miles walked to save bus fare. She could drop the old man's hand, sprint across the terminal, wave her boarding pass, beg them to wait just one more minute. They might let her on. Emma's face floated in her mind. Her daughter's small voice on the phone last night. "You'll be there when I wake up. Right, Mama? You promised." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. The old man squeezed her hand weakly, and she squeezed back, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. The paramedics finally arrived, their fluorescent vests bright against the muted airport colors, their equipment rattling as they knelt beside her. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, began checking the man's vital signs while her partner radioed for a stretcher. "Are you family?" the young paramedic asked Sarah, not looking up from her patient. Sarah watched as the flight attendant at Gate 27 pulled the door closed. She watched as the walkway began to retract. She watched as her 3 months of savings, her promise to Emma, her chance to be there, disappeared behind sealed doors. "No," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the terminal noise. "Just someone who cares." The plane pushed back from the gate. Sarah stayed on her knees, and the cold floor unforgiving beneath her, and wept. Sarah found an empty bench near a darkened gate, far from the crowds, and sat with her canvas bag clutched in her lap like a child holding a security blanket. Her hands were still shaking. The paramedics had taken the elderly man away 10 minutes ago, wheeling him toward the medical center on the far side of the airport. And she had simply stood there in the middle of Terminal C, watching travelers flow around her like she was a stone in a river. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, an accusation waiting to be answered. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and stared at Emma's contact photo. Her daughter's gap-toothed smile captured last summer at the park. Sarah pressed call. "Mrs. Chen" answered on the second ring. "Sarah?" Is everything all right? The concern in her neighbor's voice nearly broke her. I need to talk to Emma, Sarah managed, her voice cracking at the edges. She heard muffled sounds, then her daughter's small, sleepy voice. Mama? Hi, baby. Sarah pressed her free hand against her mouth, trying to hold herself together. Mama, are you on the plane? Are you flying? Not yet. Sweetheart, there was a delay. The lie tasted like ash. I'm going to be on a later flight. I'll be there, I promise, just a little later than we planned. The silence on the other end lasted forever. Then, in a voice so small it hurt. But you'll be there when I wake up? You promised. I'll be there as soon as I can, Emma. I love you so much. After she hung up, Sarah sat motionless, staring at nothing. She finally forced herself to walk to the airline counter, where a board agent informed her that the next available flight to Richmond wasn't until tomorrow morning at 8:15. The ticket would cost $230. Sarah had $63.18 to her name. She couldn't afford a hotel. She couldn't afford food beyond maybe a sandwich and coffee. She would sleep here, on these unforgiving benches, surrounded by strangers, and somehow find the money for tomorrow's ticket. She returned to her bench and opened her wallet, counting the crumpled bills and scattered coins again, as though the numbers might change if she recounted them enough times. A security guard passed by, an older man with gray at his temples. He met her eyes, and she saw sympathy there, understanding. He had seen this before, she realized. People stranded, people struggling, people trying to survive in the spaces between destinations. He said nothing, just nodded slightly and continued his patrol. Sarah pulled her frayed coat tighter and closed her eyes, and the weight of her choice settled over her like snow. Sarah had been drifting in that strange space between sleep and waking, her neck bent at an uncomfortable angle against the hard plastic armrest, when she heard the sound of heels clicking against the terminal floor with purposeful precision. She opened her eyes to find a woman standing before her, mid-50s perhaps, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 2 months. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, her posture perfect, her expression professional but not unkind. Sarah sat up quickly, suddenly aware of how she must look, her coat wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its ponytail, her exhaustion written across her face like a story anyone could read. The woman smiled gently as though sensing Sarah's discomfort. Miss Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah blinked, confused. Yes, that's me. How did you know my name? My name is Margaret Chen, the woman said, extending a hand that Sarah shook automatically. I'm the executive assistant to William Hartford. You helped him earlier today near the coffee shop in Terminal C. Sarah's tired mind struggled to connect the pieces. William Hartford, the name meant nothing to her. She thought of the elderly man, his pale face, his trembling hand in hers. Is he all right? She asked, genuine worry flooding through her exhaustion. Margaret's expression softened further. He's recovering well, thanks to you. He's resting in the airport medical center, and he's been asking for you. He wants to thank you personally. Sarah shook her head slightly, still processing. That's not necessary. I was just helping someone who needed help. Anyone would have done the same. Margaret's smile turned sad, knowing. But they didn't. You did. Mr. Hartford is quite insistent about meeting you, if you're willing. I understand you've had a difficult day. That was an understatement so profound Sarah almost laughed, but she was too tired for laughter. She thought about refusing, about staying here on her bench until morning, but the woman had kind eyes, and the old man had looked so frightened, and maybe seeing him recovered would make this whole impossible day feel like it meant something. All right, Sarah said quietly, gathering her canvas bag. I'll come. Margaret's smile was warm and genuine. Thank you. Please, follow me. The airport medical center was a small, sterile space tucked away from the main terminals, all white walls and fluorescent lighting and the antiseptic smell that Sarah knew from her hospital shifts. Margaret led her through a quiet corridor to a private room, knocked softly, and opened the door. The elderly man sat upright in a hospital bed, an IV in his arm, a heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. His color had returned. the terrible grayness replaced by healthy pink, and his eyes were alert, focused, fully present in a way they hadn't been on that terminal floor. When he saw Sarah, his entire face transformed with emotion. "You came," he said, his voice stronger now, touched with wonder. Sarah stepped inside, suddenly shy, aware of how out of place she was in this pristine medical space with her thrift store coat and worn shoes. "I'm glad you're feeling better, sir." "William," he corrected gently. "William Hartford, and I owe you my life." Sarah shook her head. "The paramedics saved your life. I just stayed with you until they arrived." William studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as though he could see through her polite deflections to something deeper beneath. "Why did you stop?" he asked. "Everyone else kept walking. You were clearly in a hurry. Why did you stop?" Sarah didn't know how to explain something that felt so fundamental, so obvious. "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. "You needed help." The words hung in the air between them, plain and honest and profound in their simplicity. William's eyes grew bright, and Sarah realized with alarm that he was fighting tears. His gaze moved from her face to her frayed coat, to the canvas bag she clutched, to the exhaustion carved into every line of her body. "Margaret tells me you missed your flight," he said quietly. Sarah forced a smile, the same brave expression she wore when Emma asked why they couldn't afford new shoes, why they had to move to the smaller apartment, why Daddy didn't visit anymore. "It's fine. There's another flight tomorrow morning." "Where were you going?" "Home. To Richmond." "For what, if I may ask?" Sarah's throat tightened. "My daughter has a small surgery today. I promised I'd be there." The words came out steady, controlled, but William Hartford had not built an empire without learning to read people, and he saw everything she wasn't saying, every sacrifice written in the space between her words, every tear she refused to shed. William turned to Margaret, who had been standing quietly by the door. "Margaret, please arrange a hotel room for Miss Mitchell, one of the suites at the Grand Meridian." Sarah's head snapped up, alarm flooding through her. "No, I couldn't possibly. That's too expensive. I'll be fine at the airport." William raised a hand gently, his expression kind but firm. "Please, you gave up your flight to help a stranger. You're sleeping on airport benches because of me. This isn't charity, Miss Mitchell. It's gratitude, and it's the absolute least I can do." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, pride and practicality warring inside her. She had survived this long by refusing handouts, by standing on her own 2 feet no matter how tired those feet became. "I appreciate it, but I really can't accept." "You can, and you will," William said, his tone brooking no argument but somehow still gentle. "You showed me extraordinary kindness today. Please allow me to show you some in return." Sarah looked between William and Margaret, saw the genuine concern in their faces, and felt her resistance crumble under the weight of her exhaustion. "Just for tonight," she said quietly. "Thank you." Margaret drove her in a sleek black sedan that smelled of leather and money, and Sarah sat very still in the passenger seat, afraid to touch anything. The Grand Meridian rose above the city like a glass and steel monument to wealth, its lobby a cathedral of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and people who moved with the confidence of those who belonged in such places. Sarah didn't belong here. Margaret checked her in with quiet efficiency, and a uniformed bellhop insisted on carrying Sarah's single canvas bag to the elevator as though it were Louis Vuitton luggage. The suite was on the 18th floor, and when Margaret opened the door, Sarah stopped breathing. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering city. A king-sized bed with more pillows than one person could possibly need dominated the space. The bathroom was larger than Emma's entire bedroom, all marble and gold fixtures and fluffy white towels stacked like clouds. "The room service menu is by the phone," Margaret said kindly. "Order whatever you'd like. It's all taken care of. If you need anything at all, my card is on the desk." After Margaret left, Sarah stood alone in the center of that impossible luxury, turned slowly in a circle, taking it all in, and finally let herself break. She sank onto the edge of the bed and cried, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and buried, crying for her missed flight and her frightened daughter and 3 months of saved pennies and the overwhelming, unexpected kindness of strangers who saw her when the whole world had taught her she was invisible. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, the sheets beneath her so soft they felt like sleeping on clouds, and for 3 disoriented seconds she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back, the old man, the missed flight, Margaret, this impossible room. She sat up quickly, checking the clock on the nightstand. 7:15. Her flight was in an hour. She needed to get to the airport. Needed to figure out how to pay for a ticket she couldn't afford. Needed to get home to Emma. She was pulling on her worn coat when her phone rang, Margaret's name appearing on the screen. "Miss Mitchell, good morning. I hope you slept well. Mr. Hartford would very much like to have breakfast with you before your flight. If you're available, I can have a car take you to the airport immediately afterward." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to thank Margaret politely, and disappear before she could accept any more kindness from these strangers. But something in her hesitated. Maybe it was the memory of William's grateful eyes. Maybe it was simple courtesy. "Of course," she heard herself say. "I'd be honored." The hotel restaurant was all white linen and silver cutlery and waiters who moved like dancers. William sat at a corner table by the windows, dressed casually now in a simple sweater and slacks, looking like someone's grandfather rather than whoever he actually was. He stood when he saw her. That old-fashioned courtesy that made her feel both respected and uncomfortable. Over coffee and pastries Sarah had never tasted before, William asked her about her life. And something about his genuine interest, the way he leaned forward and truly listened, made her speak honestly. She told him about Emma, about working double shifts at County General mopping floors that never stayed clean, about her ex-husband who left when their daughter was 6 months old and never looked back. She spoke about the small apartment she could barely afford, about walking to work to save bus fare, about the careful mathematics of poverty where every dollar had 3 jobs to do. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for pity. She simply stated facts the way someone might describe the weather, and somehow that made it more powerful, more heartbreaking. William listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in his cup, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. "You're remarkable," he said finally, his voice rough. "Your daughter is very lucky to have you." They were discussing Emma's love of drawing when the restaurant manager approached their table, moving with the careful precision of someone approaching royalty. He was a thin man in an impeccable suit, and he practically vibrated with nervous energy. "Mr. Hartford, sir," he said, his voice pitched low but filled with obvious deference. "I wanted to personally ensure that everything is to your satisfaction this morning. If there's anything at all you require, please don't hesitate to ask." William smiled kindly at him. "Everything is perfect, Thomas. Thank you." The manager nodded, retreated, and Sarah noticed for the first time that several other diners were stealing glances at their table, whispering behind raised coffee cups. An older woman in pearls stared openly, her eyes moving from William to Sarah with undisguised curiosity. A businessman 2 tables over had his phone out, seemingly taking a photo. Sarah felt suddenly exposed, confused by the attention. "Do you know all these people?" she asked quietly, when the manager had gone. William's expression became gentle, almost apologetic. "No, but they seem to know me." Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because William set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "I should explain. I own several businesses. People sometimes recognize me from the news or business journals." Sarah nodded, understanding dawning. He was a successful entrepreneur, probably quite wealthy to afford a suite at this hotel without blinking. She'd met a few doctors at the hospital who drove expensive cars and wore designer watches. William must be like them, perhaps more successful. A self-made man who'd built something impressive. Good for him. "That must be difficult," she said sympathetically. Not having privacy. William studied her face, and something in his expression shifted a kind of wonder, a barely suppressed smile. She was treating him exactly the same as she had on the terminal floor, with the same gentle courtesy, the same authentic kindness. She saw a person, not a portfolio. She cared about his privacy, not his net worth. He didn't correct her assumptions. He didn't explain the true scope of his empire, didn't mention the airline or the hotels or the dozens of companies that bore his name. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "It can be. But moments like this make it worthwhile." William's driver navigated the morning traffic with practiced ease, the black sedan gliding through streets still wet from overnight rain. Sarah sat in the back seat beside William, her canvas bag on her lap, her mind already reaching forward to Richmond, to Emma, to somehow finding the money for a ticket she still couldn't afford. She hadn't figured that part out yet, but she would. She always did. They pulled up to the departures terminal, and Sarah's door was opened by the driver before she could reach for the handle herself. She stepped out into the cool morning air, into the familiar chaos of travelers and taxis, and the constant announcements echoing from speakers overhead. William walked beside her toward the entrance, moving slowly, still recovering from yesterday's episode. Sarah noticed the Skyward Airlines logos for the first time. Really noticed them. They were everywhere, massive blue and silver signs above every check-in counter, stretching the entire length of the terminal. The airline employees wore uniforms with the logo embroidered over their hearts. Even the coffee shops bore smaller versions of the same distinctive design. She'd flown skyward yesterday. Or tried to. It was the only airline she could afford. William paused near the entrance, looking up at the enormous logo suspended from the ceiling, and said almost casually, "This is one of mine." Sarah followed his gaze, confused. "I'm sorry?" "Skyward," he said, gesturing around them. "This is one of my companies." Sarah's mind stuttered, trying to process. "You own the coffee shops?" she asked. Because that made sense. A successful entrepreneur might own the airport concessions. William turned to her, his expression gentle, almost apologetic. "The airline," he corrected quietly. "I own the airline." The world tilted. Sarah stared at him, then at the massive logos surrounding them, then back at his kind, lined face. The airline. He owned the airline, the plane she'd missed, the company name she'd seen on her ticket for 3 months. The business that employed thousands of people, he owned it. She had helped a billionaire. She had missed her flight, had given up everything for one of the wealthiest men in aviation. Her face flushed hot, then cold. "I didn't know," she whispered, though she wasn't sure why that felt important to say. William's hand touched her arm gently. "I know you didn't. That's why it mattered." "Crite!" Sarah went very quiet, her hands tightening on the strap of her canvas bag. The terminal suddenly felt too large, too bright. The weight of the revelation pressing down on her like physical force. She had helped countless people in her life, neighbors who needed groceries carried, elderly patients at the hospital who just wanted someone to listen, strangers who dropped their belongings, but those acts had been simple, uncomplicated by power or wealth or the impossible distance between their worlds. This felt different. This felt like she'd stumbled into a story that wasn't meant for someone like her. "I didn't help you because of who you are," she said, her voice small but urgent. "I didn't know. I wouldn't have done anything differently if I'd known, but I didn't." William's smile was warm, genuine, filled with something that looked almost like relief. "I know you didn't. That's exactly why it mattered." He gestured around them at the bustling terminal, at the river of people flowing past. "In my world, everyone wants something. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every kindness has an agenda. People see my name, my company, my bank account, before they see me. But you," his voice grew soft, almost reverent, "you saw a person who needed help. That's all. You saw someone in pain and you stopped, even though it cost you everything. You wanted nothing from me. You expected nothing. That's rare, Miss Mitchell. That's precious beyond measure." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. The words felt too large, too profound for what she'd done. She'd just helped someone. That's all. Anyone should have done the same. The fact that no one else had stopped didn't make her special, it made the world sadder than she wanted to believe it was. She thought about Emma waiting for her, probably scared, probably wondering why her mother had broken her promise. She thought about the ticket she still couldn't afford, about the money she didn't have, about returning to her small apartment and her double shifts and her invisible life. This moment, this surreal conversation with a billionaire in an airport terminal, felt like something happening to someone else. "I need to get home to my daughter," she said finally, because it was the only true thing she could think to say. William walked with her to the gate, moving slowly, his recovery still evident in the careful way he carried himself. Gate 27 looked different in the morning light. The scene of yesterday's crisis now just another boarding area filled with travelers checking their phones and juggling coffee cups. Sarah had planned to approach the counter, to beg for some kind of payment plan, to figure out somehow how to get on a plane with $63 to her name. But before she could move toward the desk, William reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, cream-colored and unmarked. "Please," he said, holding it out to her. "Take this." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a boarding pass first class, her name printed across the top and beneath it, a business card for Margaret Chen with a handwritten note in elegant script. "If you ever need anything at all, please call. You have a friend now." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that spilled over before she could stop them. "I can't accept this," she whispered, even as her heart broke at the thought of refusing. "This is too much. I don't need charity." William stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm, the voice of a man who had learned to cut through pretense to reach truth. "It's not charity, Sarah, it's gratitude. You gave me something yesterday that money cannot buy. You reminded me that genuine goodness still exists in this world. You saw me as a person, not a portfolio. You sacrificed everything to help a stranger." He paused, his eyes bright. "And friendship, if you'll accept it." The boarding announcement crackled overhead. "Now boarding Flight 432 to Richmond. First-class passengers may board at this time." Sarah looked down at the ticket in her shaking hands, at the card with Margaret's number, at this impossible gift from an impossible day. She thought about Emma, about being there when her daughter opened her eyes after surgery, about keeping the one promise that mattered most. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." William extended his hand, and Sarah took it, feeling the warmth of his grip, the human connection that transcended wealth and circumstance. They stood like that for a moment, two people from different worlds who had found something real in the chaos of an airport terminal. Then Sarah turned, clutching her canvas bag and her first-class ticket, and walked toward the gate. Overwhelmed by kindness she'd never expected and didn't know how to repay. Sarah had never been in first class before, had never even walked through that privileged section on her way to economy. And now she sat in a leather seat wider than her kitchen chair, surrounded by businessmen in tailored suits who tapped on laptops and sipped champagne like it was water. She felt like an imposter in her thrift store coat, her canvas bag tucked under the seat in front of her, looking shabby against the polished elegance surrounding her. A flight attendant approached, a young woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile that reached beyond professional courtesy. "Miss Mitchell, welcome aboard. Mr. Hartford wanted to ensure you had everything you needed for your flight. Please don't hesitate to ask for anything at all." Sarah realized with a start that word had spread, that somehow everyone knew she was William Hartford's guest. And they treated her not with the invisibility she'd grown accustomed to, but with warmth and respect that made her throat tight with emotion. The plane pushed back from the gate and Sarah pressed her forehead against the window, watching the ground fall away as they climbed into pale morning sky. The past 24 hours felt like something from someone else's life, like a story she'd read rather than lived. She had made one choice, just one, to stop and help someone who needed help. And that single moment had rippled outward into consequences she couldn't have imagined. She thought about kindness, about how it moved through the world like light through water, bending and refracting and touching places the original source could never see. She had stopped because it was right, because a person was suffering and she couldn't walk past suffering without trying to help. She hadn't expected anything in return. She never did. But William Hartford had seen her, truly seen her. In a way the world rarely bothered to look at people like Sarah Mitchell, and he had responded with a generosity that still felt impossible. She thought about Emma waiting for her, probably in pre-op now. Probably asking Mrs. Chen where her mama was. Probably trying to be brave. Sarah closed her eyes and sent every prayer she knew across the distance between them. The plane landed with a gentle bump and Sarah was moving before the seatbelt sign turned off, thanking the flight attendant, hurrying up the jetway, running through the Richmond terminal toward the exit, toward home, toward her daughter, toward the promise she would finally keep. The taxi dropped Sarah at County General at 9:43, and she ran through the familiar hallways that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, her worn sneakers squeaking against linoleum she'd mopped 100 times. She found Mrs. Chen in the pediatric wing, standing outside a preparation room, and her neighbor's face flooded with relief when she saw Sarah. They were about to take her back. "I told them you were coming. I told them to wait." Emma lay on a gurney in a hospital gown too large for her small frame, her dark curls spread across the pillow, her eyes wide and frightened until she saw her mother in the doorway. "Mama!" Sarah was at her side in 3 steps, taking her daughter's small hand in both of hers, kissing her forehead, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. I'm so sorry I'm late." Emma's fingers gripped hers tightly. "I was scared you weren't coming." "I will always come," Sarah whispered fiercely. "Always. I love you more than anything in this world." She walked beside the gurney as they wheeled Emma toward the operating room, holding her hand until the last possible moment, until the nurse gently told her she couldn't go further. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead one more time, whispered, "You're so brave," and watched the doors swing closed between them. The waiting room was painted institutional beige, filled with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines, and a clock that seemed to move backward. Sarah sat alone, her hands clasped in her lap, and finally allowed herself to feel everything she'd been holding back. The fear that had driven her toward that gate yesterday, the impossible choice on the terminal floor, the luxury of that hotel room, the revelation of William's identity, the kindness that had saved her when she couldn't save herself. The overwhelming, crushing weight of the past 24 hours crashed over her, and she bent forward, pressing her hands against her face, and let herself shake with the force of holding everything together for so long. An hour later, the surgeon emerged, smiling, telling her the procedure went perfectly, that Emma was in recovery, and asking for her mama. Sarah stood on trembling legs and followed him through sterile corridors to where her daughter lay sleeping, small and peaceful under white sheets. Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, took Emma's hand gently in hers, and wept with gratitude, whispering prayers of thanks to every god who might be listening. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm, with surprising speed. Sarah returned to her double shifts at County General, mopping floors that never stayed clean, emptying trash bins in rooms where she remained invisible. Emma recovered beautifully, the surgery a complete success, and within days she was back to drawing elaborate pictures of princesses and dragons at their small kitchen table. Sarah told no one about the airport, about William Hartford, about the impossible 24 hours that felt increasingly like a fever dream. She worked, she came home to Emma, she counted her dollars and made them stretch. And the world kept turning exactly as it always had. Then, a week after the surgery, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Margaret's voice was warm and professional. "Miss Mitchell, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Mr. Hartford is in Richmond on business, and he was hoping he might visit with you, if you're comfortable with that. Perhaps coffee somewhere near you? He doesn't want you to have to travel." Sarah's heart stuttered. William Hartford wanted to see her. Here, in her world. She was surprised, nervous, uncertain what a billionaire could possibly want with someone like her. But beneath the anxiety was something else. A quiet gladness that she wasn't quite ready to examine. Of course, she heard herself say. That would be lovely. They arranged to meet at Rosie's Diner, a modest cafe 3 blocks from Sarah's apartment that served coffee in mismatched mugs and pie that tasted like home. Sarah arrived early, wearing her best jeans and a sweater. Emma said made her look pretty, sitting at a corner booth and watching the door with her hands wrapped around a warm cup. William arrived exactly on time, stepping out of an ordinary sedan with no driver, no entourage, no signs of the wealth and power that defined his other life. He wore simple slacks and a cardigan, his silver hair slightly mussed from the wind. And when he spotted her through the window, his whole face lit up with genuine pleasure. He looked like someone's grandfather coming to visit. He looked like a friend. Sarah stood as he entered, and William crossed to her with hands extended, grasping hers warmly. "Sarah," he said, and there was such honest happiness in his voice that her nervousness began to dissolve. "Thank you for seeing me." Over coffee that grew cold in their cups, William began to speak, and Sarah realized she was hearing truths he rarely shared with anyone. He told her about his wife, Catherine, who had died 5 years ago after 43 years of marriage. He described how she'd been his anchor, the person who kept him human when the business threatened to consume him, who reminded him that wealth meant nothing without love. He told her about his children, successful and busy with their own lives in distant cities, calling dutifully on holidays but never really connecting, never asking how he was beyond the surface pleasantries. He was surrounded by employees, by business associates, by people who wanted things from him, but he was profoundly, achingly lonely. That day at the airport, William said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I was traveling to visit Catherine's grave. It was our anniversary, and standing there in that terminal, surrounded by all those people rushing past, I felt the weight of it all crash down. The grief, the loneliness, the realization that I could collapse and no one would stop." His eyes met Sarah's. "But you did. You saw me. Not my name, not my company, just a person who needed help. You reminded me that genuine human connection still exists, that kindness isn't extinct, that I'm not as alone as I thought." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. She reached across the table and took his hand, the same way she had on that terminal floor. "I understand," she said quietly. "My husband left when Emma was 6 months old. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, wasn't ready for the responsibility. He just walked out one morning and never came back. No calls, no visits, no child support. It was like we never existed to him." She paused, gathering the strength to continue. "I've been alone for 7 years, raising Emma by myself, working myself to exhaustion just to keep us afloat. And some days, the loneliness is so heavy I can barely breathe. But I keep going because Emma needs me, because giving up isn't an option. We survive because that's what survivors do." William squeezed her hand, and in that moment, they weren't a billionaire and a janitor, weren't separated by wealth or status, or the vast gulf between their circumstances. They were simply 2 people who had lost, who had suffered, who had kept going anyway, and who had found in each other something rare and precious, someone who understood. William cleared his throat, setting down his coffee cup with a gentle clink against the saucer, and Sarah could see he was preparing to say something important. "I have a proposition for you," he began carefully, "and I want you to hear me out completely before you respond." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, but she nodded. William leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Skyward Airlines has a community outreach program. We work with struggling families, veterans, people facing hardship who need help with emergency travel, with medical situations, with circumstances beyond their control. The program has always been important to me, but lately it's felt disconnected. Run by people who've never experienced real struggle, who can't truly understand the people we're trying to help." He paused, his eyes intent on hers. "I need someone who understands what it means to choose between groceries and rent, who knows what real compassion looks like because they've lived it, Someone who has authentic empathy. Not the kind you learn in business school. Someone with your character, your heart, your integrity. Sarah's breath caught. The position would be based here in Richmond, William continued. Normal hours, Monday through Friday. The salary is $75,000 annually, with full benefits, including health insurance for you and Emma. You'd coordinate with families in crisis, help them navigate our assistance programs. Be the human face of something that too often feels corporate and cold. Sarah stared at him, unable to process the numbers he'd just said. $75,000. That was more than she made in 3 years at the hospital. She could afford their apartment. She could buy Emma new clothes. She could be home for dinner, for homework, for bedtime stories. She could stop being invisible. This feels like charity, she whispered, fear and hope warring inside her. William shook his head firmly. It's not. I've built a company by recognizing talent and character when I see it. I saw both in you on that terminal floor. You made an impossible choice with grace and compassion. Those are exactly the qualities this position requires. This is a real job, Sarah, one you're uniquely qualified for. Not because I'm grateful, though I am, because you're exactly who we need. Sarah didn't answer William that afternoon in the cafe, though every practical cell in her body screamed at her to say yes immediately. She asked for time to think, and William graciously agreed, understanding more than she realized about pride and the cost of accepting help. That night, after Emma fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, Sarah sat alone at their small kitchen table and wrestled with herself. She had survived 7 years on her own strength, had raised her daughter without asking anyone for anything, had worked herself to the bone because that's what independence demanded. Accepting William's offer felt like admitting she couldn't make it alone, like confessing defeat after years of refusing to be defeated. It felt like charity no matter what he called it. Like she was taking advantage of one kind act on an airport floor, like she didn't deserve something this good. But then she thought about Emma, about the childhood her daughter was living, a mother always exhausted, always working, always choosing between small necessities because they couldn't afford everything. She thought about missing school plays and parent-teacher conferences, about falling asleep on the couch while Emma did homework alone at this table, about the guilt that lived like a stone in her chest because she could never be enough for her daughter when surviving took everything she had. She thought about what $75,000 meant, not in abstract numbers but in concrete reality. Health insurance, so Emma could see a doctor without Sarah panicking about the bill. New shoes when her daughter needed them. Not 3 months later, when Sarah had saved enough. Being home for dinner every night, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, being present for the childhood that was slipping past while Sarah mopped floors in the dark hours when other mothers were tucked beside their sleeping children. This wasn't about her pride. This was about Emma. This was about giving her daughter the mother she deserved. The childhood she should have. The life that didn't revolve around scarcity and sacrifice. Sarah picked up her phone with trembling hands and found Margaret's number. The next morning she called and said in a voice that shook only slightly, I accept. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book. Sarah never thought she'd get to read. She woke each morning in the same small apartment, but everything else had transformed in ways both profound and subtle. She worked at an office downtown, a modest space with photos of families they'd helped covering one wall, and she coordinated Skyward's community outreach program with a natural grace that surprised no one but herself. She listened to stories of struggle with genuine empathy because she knew those stories intimately, had lived them. Still remembered the weight of choosing which bill to pay. She treated every person who walked through her door with the same quiet dignity she'd shown William on that terminal floor, seeing them not as charity cases but as human beings deserving of respect. Emma flourished in ways that made Sarah's heart ache with joy. Her daughter came home from school to find her mother already there, helping with homework at their kitchen table, cooking dinner that didn't come from a box, reading stories before bed in voices that made Emma giggle. Emma's drawings grew more confident, more colorful, filling the walls of their apartment with princesses and dragons and families that smiled. William visited regularly, usually on Sunday afternoons, always calling ahead but never feeling like an imposition. He and Emma had become friends in their own right, the elderly billionaire and the 7-year-old girl bonding over hot chocolate and terrible jokes. When Emma's school announced their spring play, Sarah bought tickets immediately, something she'd never been able to attend before. The evening of the performance, she sat in the auditorium watching parents fill the seats, and then she saw him, William Hartford, slipping into the back row, wearing a simple sweater, holding a bouquet of flowers clearly meant for Emma. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He had come. He had driven across the city to watch a second-grade production of a fairy tale, to support a little girl who'd become precious to him, to be present for a friend. When Emma appeared on stage as a talking tree with construction paper leaves, William applauded louder than anyone. And Sarah understood fully for the first time what had happened that day in the terminal. One choice, one moment of stopping when the world kept moving, had created a ripple that expanded outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had changed William's life, and he had changed hers. And together they had created something neither could have built alone. A friendship that transcended circumstance. A kindness that multiplied itself. A reminder that seeing people truly seeing them could transform everything. 1 year to the day after Sarah Mitchell stopped on a terminal floor to help a stranger. She stood in that same airport, but the woman who walked through Terminal C now bore little resemblance to the exhausted janitor who'd clutched a ticket she couldn't afford to replace. Sarah wore professional clothes that fit properly, carried a briefcase instead of a canvas bag, and moved through the crowds with purpose. She was there for work, launching Skyward's new Traveler Assistance Program, an initiative she'd designed to help people in exactly the situation she'd faced that impossible day. She was setting up an information table near Gate 27 when she heard it, a sound that stopped her heart, the soft, desperate crying of someone trying not to fall apart in public. Sarah turned and saw her, a young mother, maybe 25 years old, sitting on the floor near a closed gate, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. A toddler slept in a stroller beside her, oblivious to his mother's distress. Sarah crossed to her without thinking, knelt down on that same terminal floor, and said gently, "Are you all right? Can I help?" The young woman looked up, her eyes red and swollen, surprised that someone had noticed, that someone had stopped. "I missed my flight," she whispered. "My son has a doctor's appointment tomorrow, and I can't afford another ticket, and I don't know what to do." Sarah's throat tightened with recognition, with memory, with the echo of her own desperation. "I understand," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Let me help you." She made calls, arranged a new flight on Skyward, coordinated a hotel room, made sure the young mother had meal vouchers and everything she needed. The woman wept with gratitude, kept saying she didn't know how to thank her, and Sarah simply smiled and said, "Pass it forward someday. Help someone else when you can." From across the terminal, William Hartford watched, leaning on his cane, his eyes bright with pride and emotion. Margaret stood beside him, and she squeezed his arm gently. They had created this together. This program, this possibility, this ripple of kindness expanding outward. Sarah's life was living proof that one moment of compassion could change everything, that seeing someone, truly seeing them in their moment of need, could transform not just one life, but dozens, hundreds, an endless chain of human connection. The world kept rushing past, travelers hurrying toward their destinations, but Sarah Mitchell knew the truth now. The secret she carried in her heart. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop.